Sarah Blackwood pulled the toppled pine through knee-deep snow, the rope biting into her raw fingers. December wind reduced via her frayed coat, with the chance of another typhoon from a ridge above, now primarily hidden by means of bare timber like bleached skeletons. A single rider on horseback observed her trek closer to the cabin. She stopped to catch her breath, vapor misting in the front of her chapped lips. The roof might require fixing before the subsequent snowfall, and nobody was to be had to help but her very own arms. 3 winters a widow had instilled in her that anticipating help supposed freezing within the blackness. Arising to her cabin, something caught her attention. Tracks in the front of the wooden pile that have been no longer hers. Huge boots, a male's. Sarah stiffened, looking along the tree-line with narrowed eyes. This became the 1/3 example this week she'd visible indications of a person spying. Smoke rose from the chimney where she'd left Thomas keeping the fireplace going. The boy become a mere 8 years vintage, but as correct as any guy 2 times his age. Coming across him half of starved alongside, that scorched wagon Teach 4 years lower back, had rescued her as a good deal as she'd rescued him. Having buried her husband and infant daughter, Thomas had given her a motive to move on. She pulled the timber to the cabin's side and rushed in, locking the door at the back of her. "Mama, why are you status through the window?" Thomas asked, his small hands turning a piece of wooden she'd supplied for him to whittle. "Are the wolves back?" "No. Thomas just checking we're prepared for the hurricane." She put her coat on its hook, now not wishing to alarm him together with her doubts. Nighttime descended swiftly with the first falls of fresh snow. Sarah lit the lantern and inspected the shotgun as Thomas slept. A noise at the door prompted her to stop, now not knocking, however something else. When all became quiet all over again, she opened the door a crack. A scrap of paper were pinned to the wooden. Sarah drew it free, its faint light held near the lantern. 5 words have been scribbled in a sturdy hand. "We ought to talk to the boy." Her arms shook as she barricaded the door. The blizzard got here down with wrathful spite. Whistling wind tore through each crack inside the cabin walls, and windows trembled like they could destroy. Thomas slept Vire inside the returned bedroom, while Sarah sat motionless in her rocking chair, shotgun throughout her legs, eyes on the door. Simply after midnight, a thumping barely louder than the typhoon induced her to face. She crept ahead, finger on the trigger. "Assist everybody there," a person's voice, pleading against the wind. Sarah hesitated. It is probably a trick. No one might be stupid sufficient to be outdoor on this climate for anything, however necessity. She opened the door, shotgun in sight. Snow blasted in, almost blinding her. A tall man was leaning against the gust, hat low, beard iced over. "Ma'am, please," he gritted through chilled teeth. "I will freeze." She stood, returned hesitantly. "Are available," then Liv returned. The man staggered in, snow clumping off his luxurious coat. As he doffed his hat, Sarah could see a 8005, 104 K0E3 FB5 BFCWDF 1E 8002, 163 F0C 30F face under the frostnipped cheeks. A face that told her of wealth and cities, not rugged frontier warfare. Ezra Morgan, he stated, holding out a trembling hand that she didn't grasp. "I used to be caught within the typhoon on my way returned to my ranch." Sarah maintained the shotgun on the prepared. "You're quite a long way from the road." Morgan appeared round her cabin, at the apparent neat poverty of it. His gaze faltered on the tough wooden toys on the table. "You have a toddler." His voice shifted, clenched before she ought to reply. The creak of the bedroom door. Thomas stood there rubbing sleep from his eyes. His darkish hair ought to mama. He appeared the stranger with interest. Morgan froze. The color ran out of his face as he looked at the boy. "My God," he breathed. "He has her eyes." Sarah moved among them. "Thomas, go to bed." Morgan's voice broke. "How antique is he?" "This is none of your. He'd be 8 now. Born in spring." Ice that wasn't even related to the typhoon started to form in Sarah's belly. "Who are you? Why have you been spying on my cabin?" Morgan by no means diverted his gaze from Thomas. "This is my son. My boy killed in an Apache raid 4 years ago after they murdered his mom." His voice grew tougher. My son, who I've thought lifeless these kind of years, I found him taking walks half dead by using a charred wagon teach. Sarah stated, her voice regular, though her coronary heart changed into racing. You weren't there. I was. I've buried an empty coffin in his honor. Do you see? 4 years I have grieved whilst my son changed into dwelling under your roof. Morgan's eyes in the end locked onto hers, solve for surprise. As soon as this storm blows over, I'm taking him domestic to my ranch in which he belongs. Thomas stared among them with bewildered eyes as Sarah watched her global begin crumbling. Early morning light pondered off new snow as Sarah sat traumatic on the timber bench in Sheriff Hayes's office. Thomas stayed at the cabin with Morgan, whilst she'd ridden into Timber Creek to confirm the person's tale. The sheriff studied the documents Morgan had protected. Delivery certificate of Thomas James Morgan, born April 12, 1875. Hayes examined in a solemn tone. Demise certificate of spouse. Clippings from the information concerning the raid. He set them down with a sympathetic, however resolute nod. Appears to be so as Mrs. Blackwood. Sarah gazed at her folded arms. He does not remember any of it. He was 4 once I took him in, close to useless from the cold. You probably did a Christian act. Rescuing him? Hayes shifted restlessly. But the regulation is as clean as creek water. Bloodkin comes first, mainly when it is the father. The regulation in no way fed him whilst he starved, by no means held him during nightmares, Sarah murmured. A reminiscence flashed approximately burying her husband James and child daughter. Elizabeth on the hillside, the lousy hollowness till Thomas had given her that means again. How that they had rescued each other. This Morgan guy, she said, how lot sway does he have right here? The sheriff grew to become away, has the largest unfold in 3 counties, bought the land from the railroad 2 years ago, has band notes on half the corporations in town, which include mine. Clearly, Cash always had a louder voice than a widow's identify. Will I have any say, any rights in Thomas's existence? Hayes sighed. Mrs. Blackwood, my word of advice is to make the fine of this. Morgan seems affordable sufficient, higher than to fight a battle you cannot win. Sarah departed the sheriff's office with lean steps. The city appeared to regard her passing with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Information traveled quickly in Wooden Creek when she reached her cabin. Thomas darted to greet her, his little palms around her waist with familiar trust. Mama, do I should go with him? He murmured. He claims to be my real father, however, I do not know him. Sarah knelt within the snow, gazing into those darkish eyes now with Morgan's words regarded to mirror the wealthy ranchers. She'd by no means taken into consideration wondering wherein Thomas had come from. Most effective grateful he changed into hers. Let's simply take some day at a time, she said, her voice firm in spite of the shattering within. As Thomas dashed lower back in her, Sarah made a quiet promise, irrespective of what the regulation demanded, irrespective of how wealthy or influential Ezra Morgan could be, she could not relinquish her son without a struggle. A few ties were deeper than blood or paper. Sarah stood on her porch, watching Morgan's shiny carriage round the bend. Thomas's small face seemed at the window, his 1/3 visit to the ranch in 2 weeks. Every time bringing frays of horses, ranch hands, and rooms large enough to run circles in. Mama, she turned back to her cabin. With determination renewed, if Thomas become comparing homes, she might make theirs sparkle in spite of its plainness. She'd already repaired the leaking roof, her hands blistered from the work. Today, she'd finish the new cabinets and perhaps start the sparkling curtains. For hours she labored, the cadence of hammer and saw drowning the fears. Her cabin were small, but it become easy. Warm and packed with love, no amount of Morgan cash may want to purchase that. Later at the overall keep, Sarah felt eyes tracking her as she bought nails and fabric, heard Morgan taking the boy. Mrs. Peterson whispered to Mrs. Provide by the dry items. Blood will tell, they are saying. Shameful, looking to hold some other's flesh and blood, came the response. Sarah saved her again straight. No longer all of us felt, therefore. The Jenkins circle of relatives, whose son she'd nursed through fever ultimate iciness, nodded respectfully. Antique Mr. Cooper, who turned into the recipient of regular deliveries of firewood from Thomas, tipped his hat. Mrs. Blackwood, a deep voice called as she exited. Decide Wilson, these days arrived at the circuit, stood with the aid of the hitching. Publish, would possibly I have a word? They stepped some paces away from prying ears. Sheriff Hayes told me of your state of affairs. He said benevolently, I wanted you to understand how these cases generally flip out. You imply I will lose him, Sarah replied bluntly. Choose Wilson's side. Blood rights typically win out, especially wherein wealthy fathers are involved. However, your years of care quantity to something. Perhaps they may discover a middle. Sarah thanked him with formal phrases that had tasted like ash. Everybody presumed Morgan would win just because he become wealthy and male. The injustice seared her chest. Whilst Morgan's carriage delivered lower back Thomas that night time, the boy ran to her with shining eyes. He confirmed me my mom's photograph. Mama, she was stunning. His face set. But I stated to him, you're my mama now. Sarah's coronary heart constricted. What did he say to that? Thomas shrugged. He went very quiet. Then said, sometimes humans will have families. After Thomas fell asleep, Sarah went outside for air. The moonlight confirmed a familiar shape on the ridge. Morgan, gazing at her cabin again, something hot and fierce surged in her chest. She wrapped up her shawl and marched up the hill to confront him. Lamplight made a golden circle round Sarah and Thomas as they stooped their heads over the Warney book. Out of doors, February winds shook the newly mended home windows, but interior turned into warm temperature, and the comforting familiarity of their nightly routine sounded out. Sarah urged as Thomas's finger moved underneath the difficult word. Excursion. He struggled, finally regarded up with triumph. It truly is right. Sarah smoothed his hair, savoring these quiet moments. More than ever, their time together had emerged as valuable as uncertainty loomed. Every night accompanied the equal routine analyzing training, prayers by means of his bed, then the story of ways she'd found him. She'd added greater info these days, fearing he may neglect these recollections in Morgan's large house. Have been you afraid whilst you observed me? Thomas requested, though he knew the answer. Terrified, Sarah admitted, but not of you. Terrified you wouldn't live on the night. Thomas nodded gravely, and then we rescued every different, miles away on the Morgan ranch. Ezra drank whiskey in his have a look at. The luxurious furniture and blazing fireplace could not thaw the sit-back that had come into him after finding Thomas alive, 4 years misplaced. He stated to his foreman, while I drowned myself in San Francisco, my boy survived after Anna's dying. Grief had led him to the metropolis, to consuming and commercial enterprise ventures that drowned the ache. He'd come lower back to Wyoming to grow his holdings, never thinking to discover his son in a widow's cabin. The boy likes her, the foreman stated carefully. She's handled him kindly. Morgan conceded, fed him, clothed him, taught him to study. He appeared into his glass. However, a boy needs his father's call, his future. Thomas will take over the whole thing I have acquired. The foreman nodded. Choose Wilson comes next week for listening to. Word is he suggestions to Bloodkin in these instances. Morgan positioned down his glass. A plan had been brewing, uncomfortable, but required. The subsequent morning, he rode to Sarah's cabin. She turned into outside chopping wooden, her breath misting within the bloodless. She laid down the axe whilst she saw him, exhaustion written in every line of her face. Mrs. Blackwood, he commenced stiffly, I have been giving idea to Thomas's properly, being, have you ever, her voice became icy, I may want to provide you an area on my land, a higher cabin. You may still see him each day. Sarah's eyes blazed. You think you can bribe me out of my home with a finer cage, Mr. Morgan? It's no longer. He stopped, irritated. Thomas loves you. I'm seeking to give you an answer. A solution where you continue to get to win. Sarah watched, but her voice had misplaced a number of its chunk. As Morgan rode away, Sarah rested against the timber stack. His inspiration had said something she'd no longer predicted, not simply the want to personal Thomas, but actual subject for the boy's happiness. Morgan was no longer the heartless tyrant she'd imagined, and that made Matters extra complicated. The January snowfall swept without pity. Snow fell so heavily it erased the line between earth and sky, shaping the world right into a howling white empty. Sarah pounded on Morgan's front door, ice crusting her eyelashes. The housekeeper's eyes widened. "Mrs. Blackwood, get in earlier than you freeze." Sarah kicked snow off her boots. The Hendersons are isolated of their cabin with the ill infant. Their roof caved in beneath the snow. They want help. Morgan emerged from his examine, Thomas at his side. "You went through this storm." Issue and surprise were jumbled together his voice. Somebody needed to. Sarah glanced around at the ranch hands who had been warming themselves by the hearth. "Will your men assist me?" The foreman approached. "Ma'am, I suggest no disrespect, but we have suspended attempting to find misplaced livestock. No guy should closing lengthy here. Then I'll return by myself." Sarah headed for the door. "I have introduced a sled. Even supposing their cabin's been destroyed, we will bring them back here. Wait." Morgan caught his coat. "I'll go together with you." Thomas eyed her anxiously. "Be secure, Mama. Pa." The obvious words that identified them each floated inside the air among Sarah and Morgan as they walked into the Yay hurricane. The trip became horrible. They twice almost misplaced the path. After they did get to the Hendersons, the circle of relatives changed into crowded into the one corner where the roof remained intact. Collectively, Sarah and Morgan loaded the unwell infant and elderly couple onto the sled and started the grueling go-back journey. They labored with unexpected efficiency together, slightly speaking, but watching for each other's movements. By the point they reached Morgan's ranch, mutual admire had fashioned among them, reluctant, however actual. After settling the Hendersons and the typhoon had passed, Sarah and Morgan rode into city to tell family at the overall save. Banker Henderson's booming voice, "Mrs. Blackwood, simply the man or woman I had to see." He waved papers in his gloved hand. "I've foreclosed on your house. 3 past due payments is all of the bank tolerates." Sarah's toes felt as if they were sinking into the floor. The price range she'd set apart for taxes had been used to restore the roof and improve the cabin for Thomas. "You knew," she said softly, going through Morgan. The flash of his eyes told her it became actual. "You knew he was suing my belongings at the same time as we have been out in that typhoon." Morgan turned away. "I thought it'd make matters less difficult for Thomas. Betrayal hurt extra than if he'd planned it himself." Morgan had now not used the knife. He'd just stepped returned to allow it to fall. Sarah hooked up, her again stiff. "I desired a truthful fight. Mr. Morgan, no longer this." She rode off and left Morgan's status in the road, snow melting below his luxurious boots. Sarah crouched beside the grave of her husband, her uncooked, bleeding hands on the obvious timber marker. Alongside it, the smaller one for Elizabeth appeared accountable her for failure. Gray February sky stretched above as barren as her future appeared. "James," she whispered, "I don't know what I'll do if I face up to Thomas sees me lose the whole thing. If I am going, the concept of beginning over someplace else by myself gutted her." Tender footsteps inside the snow sound led her to show Remedy Crow, the old native girl who had assisted in shipping of Sarah's stillborn twins all the ones years ago, watched on. Her dark eyes expressed neither pity nor judgment. "You communicate to the dead," she stated, "but your war is with dwelling." Sarah stood up immediately. "Morgan will win. He has money, have an impact on, paper law," Medication Crow said contemptuously. "Now not coronary heart law." The antique woman came ahead, analyzing Sarah's work. "Hardened fingers, what we assemble with our hands. No paper can absolutely counter this Morgan guy. He constructs with paper. You assemble with palms, with coronary heart." Sarah gazed back at the cabin she ought to see through bare trees. Each log, every shingle stood for her stubbornness to construct a domestic with Thomas. "I added in 3 dead babies before Thomas," Sarah said. The confession rung out of some hidden vicinity. "Did you recognize that 3? He is the handiest one God allowed me to keep." Medicinal Drug Crow nodded, then combat for him with truth, no longer with paper regulation. As the woman grew to become away, her words lodged. Morgan had used wealth and prison to declare weapons Sarah couldn't compete with. However, she had something he did not. 4 years of building a lifestyles with Thomas that was woven into the community around them. Sarah lowered back to her cabin determined. At her little desk, she sat down to write notes to each person Thomas had helped over time: the Coopers, whose firewood he stacked; the Jenkins, whose son he'd sat with even as having fever; the faculty kids he'd taught to make rabbit snares. The regulation would be on Morgan's aspect. However, Sarah might plead to a better court the ethical sense of right and wrong he'd shown in the course of the Blizzard rescue. She would display him what Thomas might lose if pulled out of the life they had created together. Her hand flowed smoothly throughout the paper. This wasn't capitulation. This turned into her most heroic stand. Spring's first tentative warm temperature dissolved icicles from the church eaves. Morgan stood simply inside the doorway, harassed by the crowd. Sarah's note had invited his attention for a matter referring to Thomas's destiny, but given no clue. For the 24 community members assembled, Sarah stood on the front, unruffled and dignified in spite of her undeniable get dressed. Thomas sat beside her, looking both extreme and puzzled. "Mr. Morgan, thank you for coming," Sarah started as he approached. "Earlier than the courtroom hearing subsequent week, there are folks that wanted to speak." "Antique, Mr. Cooper rose shakily to his toes. While my rheumatism got too bad to cut wood, it changed into younger Thomas, who came by means of every 2D day. Mrs. Blackwood taught him it changed into neighborly duty. Mrs. Jenkins followed while my Henry had fever last wintry weather and we couldn't pay the doctor. Sarah and Thomas sat with him for 3 nights instantly. That boy studied to Henry for hours to maintain his spirits up. Separately, associates shared tales of Thomas's place in their network, all guided via Sarah's quiet coaching. The school trainer, the blacksmith, even the preacher noted Thomas's character and Sarah's impact. Morgan listened, an increasing number of uncomfortable. He'd idea only of felony rights and his very own grief, in no way thinking about the net of connections Thomas had shaped. In the end, Sarah spoke immediately to him. "I won't combat you in court, Mr. Morgan. I can't win there, but I wanted you to see what Thomas would lose." Her voice remained regular. "You could take him by using regulation, but he's going to lose his home and his heart. This is not about who owns him. He is not property. It's approximately who he is becoming." Morgan checked out his son, really checked out him, and noticed no longer just Anna's eyes, however the individual shaped by using Sarah's 4 years of loving steerage. Then Thomas himself stood up. "I have been thinking," he said with infantile dignity. "I need my mama, Sarah, and my father, too. Why cannot I have both?" He seemed among them. "Is not that what own family is? Individuals who love you." Morgan felt something shift inside him, his awareness on ownership giving way to what Thomas absolutely needed. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Blackwood, might we communicate privately, outside?" With melting snow dripping from the roof, Morgan decided that surprised them both. April sunlight warmed Sarah's back as she directed Morgan's men where to place the lumber. The expansion to her cabin became taking form. A new bedroom, a bigger kitchen, and maintenance to climate the next iciness. "The floor desires to be level right here," she told, pointing to a mild dip. The foreman nodded respectfully, that they had all come to recognize the widow's exacting requirements. Thomas darted between employees, wearing nails and equipment with important purpose, considering that Morgan had withdrawn his one-of-a-kind custody declare. The boy had bloomed with the safety of maintaining both his worlds. The arrangement turned into uncommon but powerful. Thomas lived frequently with Sarah, however spent days each week at Morgan's ranch, getting to know about farm animals and horses. Morgan had used his impact to cancel the foreclosures complaints, and as an alternative invested in improving Sarah's property. Morgan himself arrived noon. Dismounting with the convenience of a man born to the saddle, he surveyed the development with approval. "The roof looks sound," he commented, standing beside Sarah. "It's going to want to be with bedroom addition," she answered. Their conversations remained practical, however the open hostility had faded. Together, they watched Thomas digging in the newly thawed garden soil. Morgan had introduced vegetable seeds from his greenhouse, and Thomas was growing neat rows with centered willpower. "It is now not how I imagined family might appearance," Morgan admitted. The phrases without a doubt hard for a proud guy. Sarah watched Thomas planning among them. "First, class things not often arrive how we count on. Mr. Morgan. Ezra, he corrected softly. I agree with we've got long gone past formalities. Thomas summoned them over eagerly. See what I'm planting. He displayed an acorn. Trainer says very well trees live hundreds of years. I'd want to plant one that will still be standing when I'm vintage. Sarah and Morgan exchanged a glance over his head, both of them catching the importance of roots being laid down, of a future being staked in this region. They worked along one another through the afternoon, Sarah teaching Thomas how to water the seeds effectively, Morgan the way to position up a put-up for the garden fence, their hands brushing towards one another's every so often. Now not enemies, but allies within the elevating of the boy they both cherished. At sundown colorized the spring sky, they stood facet with the aid of side surveying their paintings. The enlarged cabin, the newly planted garden, and between the garden rows inexperienced shoots thrust up in defiance of life. After wintry weather's long sentence, Thomas ran up in advance to clean for dinner, leaving Sarah and Morgan standing in at ease silence. Their unconventional family had been shaped in war, however turned into strengthening through collaboration. Like the oak sapling that would someday stand tall above the cabin, their mutual bond with Thomas could reinforce, grounded in love rather than regulation. We could move in, Sarah said, pointing closer to the cabin in which lamplight now shone in welcome. Dinner's ready. Morgan nodded, strolling along with her in the direction of the home they had been constructing together, no longer of wood and nails, however of mending hearts long shattered through grief.